The moment the horse locked eyes with the girl, everything changed. The animal suddenly started jumping around, completely out of control. The owner had no way to calm him down, and at first couldn't figure out what triggered it. But when the horse suddenly leaped out of the enclosure and charged straight toward the girl, the reason became obvious. Once the truth came to light, the owner was completely stunned. Matthew had no idea what kind of day was waiting for him. He was already stressed about his racehorse, Phantom, and the horse's very first competitive event. He was so focused on chatting with potential bettors that he didn't even notice a young woman entering the area. Phantom, who was usually calm and steady even with a crowd around, was being walked through the pen near the girl when something shifted. Matthew had never seen anything like it. His horse changed in an instant. Phantom's entire behavior flipped. Out of nowhere, the horse started acting wild. First, he began scaring the people standing near the fence. Most of them instinctively stepped back. Then, the other horses within about 10 meters of Phantom began getting nervous too. Watching Phantom's reaction, it became clear to some that the girl was the cause. As the other horses slowly moved away, Matthew still had no idea what had set Phantom off. The horse was now running wildly around the pen, and all Matthew could do was hope Phantom would eventually settle down. But Phantom wasn't calming down. He was just getting started. Without warning, the horse turned and charged full speed at a section of the gate. By now, nearly everyone around had stopped to watch the unfolding chaos. And right then, the young girl stepped forward, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment. Matthew's heart dropped as he saw Phantom jump over the tall fence. Everyone had always told him that a racing horse could never clear a fence that high. But now it was happening. Matthew was terrified, not just for Phantom, but also for the girl, who suddenly looked like she might be in real danger. It was clear to everyone now. Phantom had locked his focus on the girl, and she was the reason behind all this strange, wild behavior. The horse was charging at full speed, and Matthew still had no clue why. Had he seen this girl before? Why was his horse reacting like this? He couldn't imagine Phantom hurting anyone, but today had already proven that anything was possible. To everyone's shock, Phantom didn't hurt anyone. The wild horse reached the girl, but instead of attacking, he stopped right next to her. He just stood there, waiting. For a moment, Matthew thought the chaos was over, but he was completely wrong. What happened next was maybe even more unbelievable. The girl, still calm as ever, climbed right onto Phantom's back, and just like that, the two of them took off, running out of the prep area together. Phantom didn't even have a saddle on, yet they moved as if they'd done this 100 times. There was a kind of grace in the way they rode. Matthew was frozen, unable to even think about what he'd just witnessed. And before he could gather himself, the girl and Phantom were gone. Matthew stood there in total shock, trying to make sense of the chaos. In the distance, people could still see the horse racing away, getting smaller with every second. There were also screams echoing behind them, likely from people jumping out of Phantom's path. By the time Matthew snapped back to reality, Phantom had completely vanished. That's when it hit him. He needed to call the police. He grabbed his phone and quickly dialed. Doing his best to stay calm, Matthew began describing the girl's appearance. Thankfully, he had a decent memory for faces. As he talked, the officer on the other end tried to understand the situation. She wasn't completely sure whether this counted as a stolen horse, especially since Phantom had escaped on his own before the girl ever touched him. Still, Matthew insisted this was what had happened. Even though it was messy and confusing, the most important thing now was keeping people safe. The officer explained that they'd send out an alert to watch for the pair. A loose horse, especially one this big and strong, could easily cause a dangerous situation. It wouldn't be the first time something like this had happened in their town. Only a few minutes later, calls started pouring into the police station. Dozens of people were calling in with tips and sightings. One police car was already dispatched and heading toward the area, while another team got to work mapping out Phantom's path using the callers' locations. This helped them figure out exactly where the horse was going. Meanwhile, Phantom, still calm, still carrying the young woman, was charging straight through the middle of town. Bit by bit, it became clear that he was heading toward the suburbs on the far edge of the city. But how? How could this horse know exactly where to go? And what were they heading toward? Luckily, the city's grid-like layout made it easier to track them. But once the pair reached the outer edge and slipped beyond the final streets, the tips and sightings began to fade. Eventually, there were none at all. Still, the police search kept going. They had no idea where the pair had gone, but patrol cars began combing through the last known area. Despite their best efforts, the horse and rider seemed to have completely vanished. No one could figure out how an animal that size could just disappear. With no more leads or calls coming in, the police weren't sure what to do next. So they made a new plan. Go back to the race area and talk to people there. Maybe someone recognized the girl or had some idea of why she'd done this. There were too many questions and not enough answers. Thankfully, most of the crowd was still at the race area since the rest of the event had continued as planned. Phantom wasn't scheduled to run in all the races, so the others were going ahead without him. It might have just seemed like a missing horse slot, but it came with some unexpected consequences. One horse running off wasn't enough to cancel the entire event, even if that horse had quickly become the crowd favorite. That used to be a good thing in Matthew's eyes, but now that he was back at the venue, it had turned into a huge problem. As soon as Matthew returned, he was met with frustration and anger. A lot of bettors had put serious money on a horse that never showed up to race. Many of them had even gotten personal reassurance from Matthew himself that Phantom would do incredibly well. Of course, Matthew was frustrated that his reputation had taken such a blow, but truthfully, he didn't care that much about that anymore. All he really wanted was to find Phantom. And maybe, just maybe, one of these people had seen the girl, or even knew who she was. When Matthew asked around, most of the bettors just looked at each other, clearly confused. All they'd seen was the girl riding off on Phantom. In fact, a few of them had assumed this was a setup, that the girl was in on it with Matthew, and that he'd faked the whole thing to get out of racing. The idea shocked him. He couldn't believe anyone would think he'd pull something like that. He tried to explain to a few of the people he knew personally that nobody was more affected by all of this than he was. But even though the accusations were absurd, the truth was that scams like this had happened in the racing world before. Some shady owners had taken bets and disappeared with both the money and the horse. But Matthew wasn't here to defend himself. He was here to get answers. Still, it became clear that the bettors weren't going to be much help. No one knew the girl. No one had seen where she came from. And slowly, Matthew's hope started to fade. That's when it happened. Someone suddenly slammed right into him. It wasn't just a nudge either. It was a full-on collision, hard enough that Matthew lost his footing and fell to the ground. Before he could even react, the man who'd bumped into him was already reaching down to help him up. Matthew touched his shoulder, relieved to feel nothing seriously hurt. But then he felt something strange, something being slipped into his hand. The man didn't say much. He just nodded politely and walked off quickly. None of the officers, who had been nearby talking with the crowd for over an hour, saw what happened. That gave Matthew a chance to glance at what was now in his hand. It was a small folded note. The handwriting was rushed but clear enough. "Meet me behind the stables in 5 minutes. Don't bring the police." Matthew had no idea who this man was or what he wanted. But if there was even the slightest chance he had information about Phantom, Matthew was willing to take the risk. He calmly walked over to the nearby officers and told them he needed to make a few private calls. They didn't question it much and went back to speaking with the remaining bettors. That gave Matthew just enough time to slip away. He made his way quickly around the back of the stables, heart pounding, hoping that the mystery man would actually be there. Sure enough, he was. Matthew almost ran toward him, but the man quickly motioned for him to stay calm and quiet. From behind the stable, Matthew could tell they were completely out of view. He had 1,000 questions racing through his mind, but one mattered more than any other. He needed to know where Phantom was. If the man had any info about the girl who took Phantom, Matthew didn't expect much. But to his surprise, the man said he did. In fact, he was the one who had brought her to the race that day. Phantom's emotional owner could hardly believe what he was hearing. His jaw almost hit the ground. This was the lead he had been hoping for. Maybe now he could finally understand the girl's reasons. A flood of questions rushed through Matthew's head, but the man quickly lowered his hopes. He explained that he'd been driving in on the southern road earlier that morning when he spotted the girl hitchhiking. Since he happened to be heading to the races anyway, he offered her a ride. They barely spoke a word during the long drive, which had taken most of the morning. Matthew had been hoping for more. He admitted as much, clearly a bit disappointed. Still, the man had one more important piece of information that could help. Before Matthew could say anything else, the man started explaining where, exactly, he had picked her up earlier that day. There were 3 main reasons he didn't want the police involved. First, he didn't really trust them. Second, he knew that picking up hitchhikers was technically illegal in that area. And third, he didn't want to become a person of interest in this case. It would bring too much stress and attention. He had given someone a ride, and that was it. His days of dealing with the police were long behind him, and he wanted to keep it that way. He sighed and gave Matthew the address, but only after Matthew promised not to tell the police where he got it from. Matthew agreed, and without wasting a second, he hurried back to the officers to share the new lead. Once he rejoined the police, he gave them the address the man had shared. One of the officers asked where he got the information, but thankfully they accepted his wish to keep the source anonymous. The location was about a 30-minute drive outside of town, in the same direction the girl had been seen riding off toward. That alone gave them hope. In the rush of everything, the officers hadn't even checked what kind of place the address pointed to. When they finally arrived, with Matthew riding in the back seat, they had to double-check if it was even correct. After looking again, Matthew still couldn't believe it. The address led to a beautiful, well-kept farm, with wide green pastures and dozens of horses running freely through the fields. To Matthew, it looked like a little piece of paradise. Could this really be where the mystery girl came from? And more importantly, had she brought Phantom here? Matthew and the officers stepped out of the car. They knew they didn't have a solid reason to search the place, and it wasn't going to be easy to convince the owners to let them look around. But their main goal was to find Phantom. No one came out from any of the nearby houses to greet them at first. But things got a little easier once they slowly stepped onto the property. In the backyard, there were several young people, probably in their 20s, walking around. And from the way they were dressed, they looked like horse caretakers. And then, finally, Matthew spotted the girl he'd been hoping to find. When she noticed them approaching, her face showed the same kind of surprise Matthew felt. She was probably startled, but it was clear she also realized she had no way to run now. So she stood still, waiting as Matthew and the officers walked straight toward her and the others nearby. The 3 of them immediately began asking questions, but before the girl could answer, an older man and woman came running out of the main building. They didn't look nearly as welcoming as the girl had. Both of them started shouting what sounded like concerned questions, asking what the group was doing to their daughter. It took a few minutes before everyone calmed down enough to even start making sense of things. One of the officers suggested they all sit at a nearby picnic table to talk things through. And that's when the story began to unfold, and things became a lot clearer, very quickly. This wasn't just a regular horse farm. It turned out to be a rescue center for horses, where older, retired, or mistreated horses were cared for with love. The older couple and their children ran the place together, making sure the animals could live out their lives in peace. Sometimes the horses were even rehomed to new owners. Without realizing it, Matthew had brought Phantom back to a place the horse already knew. Phantom had actually been born on this very farm. His mother was taken in while she was still pregnant. He had been a healthy, strong foal and was eventually sold. But the couple admitted that looking back, they probably should have looked into the buyer more carefully. The man who originally bought Phantom was from a different part of the city, where racing was popular. He had lied, claiming Phantom came from a famous bloodline, which made the horse seem extremely valuable. Matthew, as the third owner, had fallen for the scam and paid a large amount of money for him. Back when Phantom was still just a young foal at the farm, the couple's youngest daughter, Stacy, had spent a lot of time with him. They had formed a strong bond, and that's why, the moment she saw him again at the race, she instantly knew it was Phantom. And somehow, despite the years, Phantom had recognized Stacy too. Stacy admitted she'd made a dumb decision by taking off with Phantom like that. But she also said that the horse had approached her first, and he willingly left the track to follow her. She confessed she just wanted to bring him back here, back home, though she hadn't really thought about the consequences. Everyone at the table was moved by the story. Even Stacy's parents looked shocked. They had no idea Phantom was now staying in one of their stables. She had kept the whole thing a secret from them. The older couple looked at each other and then at Matthew. Naturally, Matthew was getting his horse back. He thought for a moment about pressing charges or asking for compensation. After all, he'd lost a lot of money that day. But in the end, he decided not to. He said later that he could feel the real connection between Stacy and Phantom. The girl hadn't meant any harm. She just made a reckless choice. And above all else, Matthew was just happy to have Phantom back where he belonged. If you enjoyed this story, please give the video a thumbs up and consider sharing it with someone who'd love a heartwarming horse tale like this. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.